Dear friends, I'm planning to share an audio analysis of the novel on YouTube. If viewers are interested in further analysis, I'm open to exploring specific perspectives for analysis. These analyses can be either concise or more depending on the audience's preference. If you enjoy my content, please consider showing your support by liking and commenting on the video. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray lends itself to a captivating psychological analysis. Through the lens of psychology, the novel delves into the intricate workings of the human mind, including concepts of self-identity, repression, influence, and the darker aspects of human nature. Several psychological themes are prominent in the novel. 1. Self and identity. Exploring the concepts of self and identity in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray from a psychological perspective reveals the intricate ways in which the character's sense of self-image, and psychological processes are portrayed. Several key aspects can be analyzed. Self-perception vs. others' perception. Dorian Gray's self-perception and how he views himself diverge significantly from how others perceive him. His external appearance remains youthful and untainted, while his portrait reflects the true corrupted state of his self. This disparity between self-perception and external perception highlights the psychological complexity of maintaining a facade while harboring inner darkness. B. The dual nature of identity. Dorian's dual identity, his external persona and his internal hidden self, captures the psychological concept of the divided self. This duality is heightened by his decision to project his immoral actions onto the portrait, symbolizing the separation of his physical and moral identities. C. Fear of aging and mortality. Dorian's fear of aging and mortality drives him to preserve his external appearance at any cost. This obsession reflects the psychological dread of mortality and the desire for a continuous and unchanging identity. His willingness to sacrifice his soul for eternal youth exposes his psychological vulnerabilities. D. Deception and self-deception. Dorian's deceitful behavior, particularly his ability to manipulate those around him, emphasizes the psychological concept of self-deception. He deceives others while simultaneously deceiving himself by avoiding facing his own moral decline. This intricate web of deception reflects the fragility of his self-identity. E. The influence of others. Lord Henry's influence shapes Dorian's self-image and behavior. Dorian's malleability and susceptibility to external influences mirrors psychological theories about the role of socialization and environment in shaping identity. Dorian's transformation reflects the powerful psychological impact of exposure to certain worldviews. F2. The inner struggle. Dorian's inner struggle between his external appearance and his internal conscience illustrates psychological concepts of cognitive dissonance and moral conflict. His self-image as an outwardly virtuous individual contrasts starkly with his underlying depravity, creating a psychological tension within him. GG. The unconscious and repression. Dorian's portrait symbolizes the repressed aspects of his psyche. He attempts to suppress his guilt and maintain a positive self-image, but his repression ultimately leads to psychological turmoil. This reflects the Freudian idea of repressed desires and the psychological toll of attempting to suppress them. 2. Repression and the unconscious. In Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, the psychological concepts of repression and the unconscious play a pivotal role in shaping the character's behaviors and the overall narrative. Examining these concepts from a psychological perspective provides insights into the character's internal struggles, desires, and the psychological mechanisms at play. AU. Repression of desires. Repression refers to the psychological mechanism by which unacceptable or distressing thoughts, feelings, or impulses are pushed into the unconscious mind. Dorian Gray's repression of his immoral desires, including his pursuit of pleasure and hedonism, is a central theme in the novel. He strives to maintain a facade of morality and innocence, repressing his darker inclinations beneath the surface. Baby. The unconscious mind. The unconscious mind, according to Freudian psychology, consists of thoughts, memories, and desires that are not consciously accessible but influence behavior. Dorian's portrait represents his unconscious desires and moral corruption. As he indulges in hedonistic pursuits, his portrait reflects the hidden deterioration of his character that he refuses to acknowledge. CEEC. The double life. Dorian's double life, where his outward appearance remains youthful and virtuous while his portrait reflects his true moral decay, exemplifies the concept of the unconscious. His conscious self is in conflict with his unconscious desires and actions, leading to a psychological divide that mirrors Freud's ideas about the conscious and unconscious mind. D. Projection onto the portrait. Dorian's decision to project his sins and guilt onto the portrait exemplifies the psychological process of projection. He displaces his unconscious desires and immoral actions onto the portrait, attempting to maintain a sense of innocence and purity in his conscious self. Key. Psychological conflict and turmoil. As Dorian's unconscious desires become more apparent through the changes in the portrait, his psychological conflict intensifies. His internal struggle between his conscious self and his unconscious desires leads to increasing psychological turmoil, contributing to his downward spiral. FUF. Effects of repression. Dorian's repression of guilt and moral conflict leads to psychological distress. His inability to confront his actions and desires manifests as increasing paranoia, emotional instability, and a deteriorating mental state. HG. The portrait as a symbol. The portrait serves as a powerful symbol of the unconscious mind and repressed desires. Its transformation reflects the psychological toll of denying and suppressing one's true self. 3. Influence and environment. In The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, the psychological concepts of influence and environment play a significant role in shaping the character's behaviors, decisions, and moral trajectories. Viewing the novel through the lens of these concepts provides insights into how external factors contribute to the character's psychological development. Lord Henry's influence. Lord Henry Wotton's influence on Dorian Gray exemplifies the power of external forces on shaping individual psychology. Lord Henry's hedonistic philosophy and cynical worldview gradually reshape Dorian's perceptions, attitudes, and desires. Dorian becomes increasingly susceptible to Lord Henry's influence, leading him down a path of moral decay. BB. Society's expectations. Society's expectations and norms exert a powerful influence on the character's behavior. Dorian's initial desire to maintain a facade of virtue is influenced by the societal pressure to conform to Victorian moral standards. This societal influence contributes to his internal conflict and the development of his double life. ACE, peer pressure, and social circles. Dorian's association with Lord Henry exposes him to a new social circle that celebrates hedonism and pleasure seeking. This shift in environment influences Dorian's values and decisions, leading him to prioritize instant gratification and self-indulgence over morality. DD. Duality of influence. The characters in the novel experience conflicting influences from different sources. While Dorian is influenced by both Lord Henry's hedonism and Basil's artistic ideals, his susceptibility to negative influences leads to his moral downfall. This duality of influence underscores the psychological tension between competing external forces. A. Psychological vulnerability to influence. The characters' psychological vulnerabilities contribute to their susceptibility to external influence. Dorian's naivete and search for identity make him particularly receptive to Lord Henry's charismatic rhetoric and corrupting philosophy. FEF. Change in values and priorities. As Dorian becomes increasingly influenced by Lord Henry's worldview, his values and priorities shift. He abandons his earlier ideals and embraces a hedonistic lifestyle, reflecting the profound impact of external environment on psychological transformation. GG. Cognitive dissonance and moral conflict. The clash between Dorian's original moral beliefs and the hedonistic philosophy he adopts creates cognitive dissonance, a psychological discomfort resulting from holding conflicting beliefs. This inner conflict contributes to his emotional turmoil and self-destructive behavior. H. Escalation of influence. The novel illustrates how influence can escalate over time. Dorian's initial exposure to Lord Henry's ideas evolves into a complete transformation of his character, illustrating the gradual erosion of his original identity due to external influence. 4. Narcissism and vanity. Narcissism and vanity are central psychological themes explored in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Analyzing these themes from a psychological perspective offers insights into the characters' motivations, behaviors, and the psychological complexities that underlie their actions. A. Dorian's obsession with youth and beauty. Dorian's infatuation with his own youthful appearance reflects narcissistic tendencies. His desire to preserve his external beauty at any cost reveals his preoccupation with self-image and an excessive need for admiration. BB. External validation and self-worth. Dorian's vanity is driven by his need for external validation. His self-worth is closely tied to the approval and admiration he receives from others. His pursuit of beauty and admiration becomes a manifestation of his desire to enhance his self-esteem. CEC. Lord Henry's influence on narcissism. Lord Henry's philosophical ideas about beauty, pleasure, and self-indulgence reinforce Dorian's narcissism. Lord Henry's words resonate with Dorian's existing inclinations, fueling his vanity and encouraging him to prioritize his own desires above all else. D.T. Fear of aging and mortality. Dorian's fear of aging and his desire to avoid the reality of mortality contribute to his narcissistic behavior. His obsession with preserving his youthful appearance reflects a psychological attempt to escape the anxieties associated with the passage of time. The portrait as a reflection of inner self. The portrait serves as a psychological mirror that reflects Dorian's true corrupted self. As he remains visually untouched by his immoral actions, he becomes increasingly detached from the consequences of his behavior, reinforcing his narcissistic perception of himself. FFHU, vanity and moral decay. Dorian's vanity leads him down a path of moral decay. His willingness to prioritize his own physical appearance and hedonistic desires over moral principles reflects the psychological erosion of his moral compass. GG. Objectification of others. Dorian's narcissism extends to his objectification of others, particularly women. His interactions with Sybil Vane and other female characters highlight how he views them as extensions of his own desires and as instruments for his self. Gratification, HA, isolation and alienation. Dorian's narcissism contributes to his emotional isolation. His self-absorption prevents him from forming genuine connections with others, leading to psychological alienation and a lack of true intimacy. 5. Split personality and dichotomy. The psychological concepts of split personality and dichotomy are evident in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Examining these themes from a psychological perspective reveals the complex interplay between characters' outward appearances and their inner conflicts. AU. Dorian's dual identity. Dorian Gray's character embodies a psychological split personality. His external facade presents him as a charming, handsome, and virtuous young man, while his hidden actions and inner desires reveal his true, corrupted nature. This duality creates a psychological tension between his public image and his private actions. B. The portrait as symbolic dichotomy. The portrait serves as a tangible representation of the split between Dorian's outward appearance and his inner psyche. As the portrait bears the physical consequences of his immoral behavior, it becomes a symbol of the psychological separation between his idealized self and his darker impulses. CC. Conflict between morality and hedonism. Dorian's internal conflict between his moral conscience and his hedonistic desires embodies the psychological dichotomy between right and wrong. His pursuit of pleasure and beauty contrasts with his suppressed moral sense, reflecting the inherent tension between opposing psychological forces. D. Struggle with guilt and conscience. Dorian's split personality leads to a psychological struggle with guilt and conscience. His outward charm masks his inner turmoil as he wrestles with the consequences of his actions and the dissonance between his public persona and his private deeds. E.T. Erosion of moral boundaries. The psychological dichotomy between Dorian's self-perception and his true actions contributes to the gradual erosion of his moral boundaries. He compartmentalizes his behaviors, leading to a widening gap between his idealized self, image, and his corrupted reality. FEF. Masking inner desires. Dorian's split personality involves masking his inner desires from public view. He presents himself as virtuous and proper, while indulging in hedonistic pursuits in secret. This duplicity illustrates the psychological complexities of managing conflicting aspects of the self. GG. Psychological impact on relationships. Dorian's psychological dichotomy affects his relationships with others. His inability to reconcile his external charm with his internal corruption leads to strained interactions, deception, and a disconnect between his projected image and his true self. 6. Deterioration of morality. The theme of the deterioration of morality is a central psychological aspect in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Analyzing this theme from a psychological perspective reveals the characters' gradual descent into moral decay, their internal struggles, and the psychological mechanisms behind their changing ethical compass. AU. Initial moral ambiguity. At the beginning of the novel, Dorian Gray is introduced as a young man with a strong moral compass. However, his interactions with Lord Henry expose him to a philosophy that challenges traditional morality, setting the stage for his moral deterioration. BD. The influence of external factors. Dorian's exposure to Lord Henry's hedonistic ideas triggers a psychological shift in his beliefs and values. The external influence of Lord Henry's philosophy gradually erodes Dorian's moral foundation and encourages him to prioritize pleasure and self-indulgence. As CEE, the portrait as a reflection of morality. The portrait's transformation reflects Dorian's moral decline. As he commits increasingly immoral acts, the portrait becomes increasingly grotesque, representing the psychological toll of his corrupt behavior on his inner self. D. Dorian's moral deterioration is accompanied by psychological coping mechanisms. He suppresses guilt, rationalizes his actions, and compartmentalizes his behaviors, allowing him to maintain a facade of morality while indulging in hedonism. A key. Progressive desensitization. Dorian's moral degradation follows a pattern of progressive desensitization. His initial reluctance to engage in unethical behavior gives way to a gradual acceptance of more extreme actions, reflecting the psychological phenomenon of becoming accustomed to progressively harmful actions. FAK. Cognitive dissonance. As Dorian's actions become increasingly at odds with his original moral beliefs, he experiences cognitive dissonance, a psychological discomfort resulting from holding contradictory thoughts. His attempts to reconcile his actions with his beliefs contribute to his psychological turmoil. GG. Escalation of immorality. The novel illustrates how the deterioration of morality can lead to a cycle of escalating immoral behavior. Dorian's early choices snowball into more significant transgressions as the psychological barrier to unethical actions weakens over time. H. Emotional consequences. Dorian's moral deterioration takes a toll on his emotional well-being. His psychological struggles, increasing paranoia, and inner conflict contribute to his mental and emotional deterioration. 7. Fear of aging and mortality. The fear of aging and mortality is a prominent psychological theme in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Analyzing this theme from a psychological perspective reveals how characters' reactions to mortality impact their behaviors, motivations, and psychological states. AD. Dorian's obsession with youth. Dorian Gray's fear of aging and mortality drives his obsession with preserving his youthful appearance. This fear reflects a common psychological response to the existential anxiety surrounding the inevitability of death. BBU. Psychological defense mechanisms. Dorian's fear of aging leads him to adopt psychological defense mechanisms. His decision to project his immoral actions onto the portrait can be seen as a way to deny the consequences of his choices, allowing him to avoid facing his own moral decay and mortality. LUCE. Pursuit of immortality. Dorian's desire to maintain his external beauty reflects a psychological quest for a form of immortality. The fear of mortality drives him to seek a way to escape the inevitable process of aging and decay. DD. Avoidance of existential dread. Dorian's hedonistic lifestyle and his pursuit of pleasure can be interpreted as attempts to distract himself from the existential dread associated with mortality. Engaging in pleasure-seeking behaviors becomes a psychological strategy to momentarily alleviate his fear of the unknown. A key. Fragmented self-identity. Dorian's fear of aging contributes to the fragmentation of his self-identity. His external appearance remains youthful, but his hidden actions and the portrait's transformation reveal the psychological turmoil caused by the dissonance between his idealized self and his true nature. FIF. Psychological toll on relationships. Dorian's fear of aging and the lengths he goes to in order to preserve his appearance take a toll on his relationships. His refusal to age leads to emotional detachment, impacting his ability to form meaningful connections and intimacy. GUG. Cognitive dissonance and emotional strain. Dorian's fear of aging leads to cognitive dissonance, a psychological discomfort arising from holding contradictory beliefs. His attempts to maintain a youthful appearance while indulging in immoral behavior create internal conflict and emotional strain. HAH. Escalation of psychological turmoil. As Dorian's fear of aging intensifies, his psychological turmoil escalates. The psychological toll of his fear contributes to his emotional instability, increasing paranoia, and eventual mental breakdown. 8. Consequences of unchecked desires. The consequences of unchecked desires are a central psychological theme in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Examining this theme from a psychological perspective reveals how characters' unbridled desires lead to internal conflict, moral decay, and psychological deterioration. AU. Dorian's pursuit of pleasure. Dorian Gray's pursuit of unchecked desires, primarily the pursuit of pleasure and indulgence, leads to a psychological spiral of moral decay. His initial innocence gives way to a relentless pursuit of hedonism that gradually consumes him. BB. Escalation of gratification. Dorian's unchecked desires escalate over time. He initially rejects Sybil Vane out of disgust when she fails to meet his romanticized expectations, demonstrating his inclination toward instant gratification. This pattern continues as he seeks more immediate and intense forms of pleasure. CEC. Psychological coping mechanisms. As Dorian indulges in his desires, he develops psychological coping mechanisms to justify his actions. He rationalizes his behavior and compartmentalizes his immoral deeds, allowing him to maintain a facade of virtue while indulging in unchecked hedonism. DE. Deterioration of empathy. Unchecked desires lead to a deterioration of Dorian's empathy and compassion. As he becomes increasingly consumed by his own pleasure seeking, he becomes disconnected from the suffering and feelings of others, reflecting the psychological impact of self-centeredness. E. Psychological paradox of pleasure. Dorian's unchecked desires create a psychological paradox. Despite indulging in pleasure, he experiences psychological turmoil and inner conflict. His pursuit of unchecked desires yields fleeting moments of pleasure, but ultimately leads to profound psychological unrest. UIEEE. The portrait as a psychological mirror. The portrait serves as a psychological reflection of Dorian's unchecked desires. As his moral decay progresses, the portrait becomes increasingly grotesque and distorted, symbolizing the psychological consequences of his actions on his inner self. GG. Loss of identity and moral core. Dorian's unchecked desires lead to a loss of his original identity and moral core. He becomes unrecognizable to those who knew him, illustrating the psychological erosion of his character due to his unchecked pursuit of pleasure. HA. Psychological turmoil and dissent. Unchecked desires contribute to Dorian's psychological turmoil and eventual descent into madness. The conflict between his public image and his private actions exacerbates his inner turmoil, leading to a profound psychological breakdown. In the Picture of Dorian Gray, the exploration of the consequences of unchecked desires provides a psychological exploration of the interplay between immediate gratification, moral conflict, and the gradual erosion of the psyche. The character's experiences serve as a cautionary tale about the psychological toll of pursuing desires without restraint and the ways in which unchecked impulses can lead to a deterioration of one's moral and psychological well-being. Through psychological analysis, the Picture of Dorian Gray becomes a vivid exploration of the human psyche's intricate workings. The novel's portrayal of Dorian's inner struggles, his indulgence in hedonism, and the resulting psychological conflicts provide a thought-provoking examination of the interplay between desires, morality, and the darker aspects of human nature.